Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Catherine Sherry. I am the Clinical Program Manager with HD Reach. This past, 2 weeks ago, we had our in-person education event. I hope you could have joined us that day. If you weren't there, you probably don't know that we ran out of time during our Ask the Experts panel. So today with me, I have Dr. Mary Edmondson, founder of HD Reach and HD Extraordinaire. And we have a few minutes to catch up with her today to ask her some of the questions we didn't get to. So without further ado, what should I do if I think someone in my family is having suicidal thoughts?
This is a tough one. So depression and suicidal thoughts are common in Huntington's disease. About 50% of people who are at risk and or have the gene expansion experience suicidal ideation at one point or another during the course of their disease. The risk of suicidal ideation goes up immediately before diagnosis, and it goes up immediately around the time that people are beginning to lose independence. They're having more trouble getting their activities at daily lit. They can still do it, but they're having more difficulty with ADLs. They, still might be in public spaces with lots of noise and distractions, but it's getting more and more difficult. And or there are performance issues at work, or there's kids fighting back, people know when things are out of balance around them. And so that's another time where people might feel backed into a corner. So I think the most important thing to know is whether or not people are hopeless or not, and whether or not they use that actual word to describe their inner state. Are you feeling hopeless about X, Y, or Z? And is there something that you do have hope for? And hopelessness is a primary symptom in assessing suicidal ideation. The second thing is that you really need to ask. There's some misconceptions about talking about suicide. There's a misconception that if you talk to somebody about suicide, they're more likely to commit suicide or to act on suicidal thoughts. And the opposite is actually true. The more you talk about it, that risk tends to go down. So that is really important that if you have that concern, to verbalize it, because your concern is out of love. It's not out of wanting to take control from somebody. It's out of love for them, and out of a sense of responsibility to to support them in living the best life they can and keeping them safe during periods of temporary hopelessness, or intermittent hopelessness. So let's say that you've talked to your loved one and they are having suicidal ideation. So there's a spectrum of risk associated with suicidal ideation. For example, some people may have intermittent, sort of all the time thoughts of suicide, but they occur every month or every 3 months, and they're low intensity, and there's no plan or intent around it. It's just a fleeting thought. That's a much different risk issue, and the time frame around addressing it is different than if somebody, you notice somebody's writing their will, or they're giving their things away, or they're isolating themselves more and more, or you think you've got this idea that maybe they're hoarding pills, or if they become more thoughtful and interested in guns or other weapons. So those are like the real, if you can't talk to somebody, those are some of the behavioral things that suicidal people do that are harbingers of a much riskier situation. So you need to act a little bit more quickly in those situations than you would otherwise. So there's a big spectrum from low intensity, low risk of behavior to very high intensity, a lot of frequency, a lot of sort of obsession about that solution for their problems. And so that, that's the highest spectrum, and most everybody is somewhere in between, right? So a layperson, family member, is probably not trained in suicide assessment. And it's probably not a good idea to make a risk or make a judgment, because then that places the responsibility for protecting that individual on your shoulders. And you shouldn't, no shoulds. It's not in your best interest to take on that worry and that the burden of making that judgment. So if you have any questions about someone's safety, talk about it. That's really important. Ask the patient, get some sense of how intense the thoughts are, how frequently they occur, has the frequency changed? Just open the door to discuss it, because suicidal ideations are profoundly painful to the person experiencing them. It's a solution to the anguish that they're feeling. And anguish is anguish because you're alone and you see no way out. You don't see a different perspective. You've come to the end of what you think your options are, but someone else may be able to say something to you that would sort of expand your ability to create a solution. And so talking about it is really incredibly important, and getting into the nitty-gritty of those thoughts and not overreacting. Be calm, be thoughtful, be supportive, be validating, because you're not going to give people to open up to you unless they're really certain that you've got their best interest in heart and you really want this to be an outpatient problem. You don't want this to, your knee jerk is not going to be to call the police. Your knee jerk is to say, okay, let's together figure out how risky this is and what treatment intervention is going to make this better for you. Okay. So suicidal ideation is always, my mind, my opinion is there needs to be a change in treatment plan. Mm-hmm. And maybe that change in treatment plan is just talking about it. Maybe the change in that treatment plan is to get clear about what's the reason for that person to live and what the consequences of suicide would be on the people that person loves. And, challenge the belief that life after death, nobody knows what life after death, nobody can tell you what's going to happen after you die. It could be better, it could be worse, it could be nothing. And so this idea that you're getting away from something and it will be better afterwards, is that actually true? And based on your religious beliefs, it may be true. But in fact, people who have a strong religious belief are less likely to commit suicide. So this just needs to be a conversation, and hopefully you and that person experiencing suicidal ideation can together come to a compromise about what to do. But it should always be a conversation with a healthcare professional, also helping you assess risk. So you need to get help. And that help might be, okay, tomorrow morning we're going to call the Huntington Center that I go to, or I'm going to call my primary care physician, right? And they can assess how quickly you need to get in to see them. But there needs to be some kind of change in that person's treatment plan, whether it's a medication adjustment, whether it is psychotherapy, whether it is a change in family behavior or environmental changes. It may just be the reassurance that people love you, and whatever difficulty Huntington's disease causes them, they'd rather be standing at your side than anywhere else in the world. And so those are the interventions. Now, let's go back to the person who is hoarding pills, is preoccupied with guns, is isolating, and their despair and anguish you can sense is really great. Mm-hmm. In that situation, you need more immediate help, and you have two choices. Most states and counties have come up with a crisis intervention system where a team of people will come to your home and assess what's going on at home. So it's not like the patient, you have to call the cops and the cops pick somebody up and treat them like a criminal and all that. They come to your house. It usually involves a mental health professional and a CIT trained officer, meaning someone who is trained in crisis intervention techniques for people who have mental health complications. So, but their lead time might be 2 or 3 hours. If you think you have 5 minutes, it behooves you to call 911. Now, what you can do to make sure that it's not a traumatic intervention with law enforcement is to say, my loved one has a neurologic disease called Huntington's disease. People with ADHD tend to be impulsive. I'd really prefer, if available, that a CIT trained officer comes and that those officers who come understand that this is not a criminal situation. This is a mental health issue, and that we need to be thoughtful about the fact that this person's actually suffering emotionally. If you can't get all of that out, that's fine. But asking for a CIT trained officer should communicate that it's a mental health emergency. Those are the things that you can do. If you call law enforcement because you have fears that that person has active and serious suicidal ideation, you need to be prepared to explain that to the law enforcement officers who arrive. So you need to be out front. You need to be able to tell them whether there are weapons in the home and how dangerous that person is. And you need to be prepared to give them the backstory that's going to help them understand that this is not a low-risk situation, okay? They may do that in front of the patient themselves. And that might be a difficult thing for you to have to do in front of the person that you love. The truth of the matter is, you're concerned about them ending their life or harming someone else. And from my experience, people that are suffering that bad, who are involuntarily committed, are very grateful that they were involuntarily committed. And usually you can make a relationship repair afterwards because you did this. You're doing this out of love. You're not doing this because you just want to get somebody out of your house. And if you want to get somebody out of your house because you can't care for them anymore, that's a whole different issue. This is, I'm worried that somebody's going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. So in general, just be validating, be supportive, continue to remind somebody how much you care about them being alive, that they're not a burden to you, that this is what you want to do. You want to be with them and you want to be there for them. And no matter what they say, no matter how much they yell at you, no matter how much they fight the police, there's going to be a different person on the other side of this intervention. Nobody wants to do it. Sometimes it's absolutely the right thing to do. And if you do it and they get to the hospital and the hospital releases them, that does not mean that it wasn't the right thing for you to do. It's a very hard thing to do to take away somebody's civil liberties. And what you're actually asking that law enforcement officer to do is to take your loved one into the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. You are not committing that patient to involuntary treatment, right? That's a judgment that can only be made by a doctor. And that will be reassessed in a mental health facility 24 or 48 hours later, so that there's 2 doctors that agree that that person needs to be involuntarily committed. And just because they're involuntarily committed does not mean they can be force medicated. Like, they still have choice, right? Unless somebody's agitated and completely out of control and are actively presenting a danger to themselves or other people, that's the only time somebody can be force medicated, and they can only be force medicated once. So this deprivation of civil liberties does have limits, and it does have to be carefully thought out by the mental health professionals who are working with that patient. So that's what you need. You need a mental health professional to make an independent, well thought out risk assessment and decide about what to do about that person. And hopefully they are going to be committed to the least restrictive environment, and the least restrictive environment is outpatient treatment. And that's the goal. Even if they go into a psychiatric facility, they're going to be released at some point. So suicidal ideation has a treatment of that has to occur in the outpatient setting as much as the inpatient setting. And then the final thing that I would suggest is that just because the immediate crisis is over with doesn't mean you don't need to continue to talk about this. So follow-up is really important. For example, there's a study that shows that if a doctor who has assessed a patient for suicide and sends them home, simply sends them a card within 5 to 7 days after discharge, that reduces suicidal behavior. And so follow-up and continued expressions of concern are as important as anything else you might do. So keep talking about it.
So that's a wonderful message to kind of, that's a great takeaway, just knowing that as a caregiver, your concern for your loved one will have an impact. The professional doctors that are treating them, their continued concern will have an impact. I know that one thing that we have talked about here in HD Reach is for the caregivers and the family to think about a safety plan early on, so that you're not in the heat of the moment or when the concerns are really mounting, scrambling to have a plan, know who to call. So to have all of that information in one place. So a shameless plug for our website. We do have our safety plan and PDF version on our website. So, that's all part and parcel of being well prepared, so to speak.
Well, and I think it sets a stage for communication, because the safety plan builds on itself. The first thing that you ask is, okay, what are the symptoms that bother you? Second is, what are the things that trigger that symptom? If you have that symptom, can you distract yourself? And if so, what are your coping skills that you can use yourself that will help that symptom go away? Next, who is a person that you can call that will distract you from these thoughts? The next one is, who can you call to walk you through coping strategies and remind you of coping strategies, so they're actively helping you reduce it? Important to note that if you call that person, you have to do what they suggest you do. You can't just call and complain. You have to actively do what that person suggests that you do. And if that fails, then you call the doctor. And if you feel like that doesn't work, then you need to know your community resources that will help you. And the very last question on that safety template is, this is the reason I want to live. That's the last question on a safety plan. And in many ways, it's the absolute most important one, because it allows somebody who's suicidal to focus back in on their true north and say, okay, so this is what really matters to me. And balancing that with, whatever despair I feel, can I give it a chance? Can I give these interventions a chance?
We are going to continue to have monthly webinars as follow-ups to some of the subject matter. For instance, June 21st, we're doing an interaction with law enforcement. It kind of really dovetails nicely to what Dr. Edmondson was saying earlier about if you have to call 911, if you have to call authorities. CIT officer, and so on and so forth. So definitely tune in. But thank you, Dr. Edmondson, for being here today. And we are just so lucky to have you as one of our experts. So,
Well, I'm lucky to be here.
all right. Well, thanks, everyone. Take care.
Care.